This is Lisa Miller and Associates, Florida Insurance Roundup, your podcast on the people, issues, and regulations shaping Florida's insurance market. Now, here's Lisa Miller.
Welcome, friends. Floods are the most common and costly natural disaster in the U.S. As we record this podcast on June 14th, 2024, most of South Florida is under a governor's disaster declaration for this week's rainfall of more than 24 inches in some areas. In speaking to my colleagues there, it is nothing short of a natural disaster and causing havoc throughout the streets of our beautiful South Florida. Suppose instead of spending $2.69 for every unit of flood damage to your home this hurricane season, you could spend $1 instead. That's the dollar sale, SALE, outlined in a new working paper from the U.S. Congressional Budget Office. Researchers say, depending on the home's location and area income, spending that dollar could save more than $6. How? By avoiding the damage in the first place, primarily through buyouts and elevating flood-risky properties. The paper says the money to do so comes from not just the federal government, but local governments and from homeowners themselves. The big picture cost avoidance is even more impressive. The total cost of completing these projects across the nation would be $193 billion, and that is with a B, preventing $519 billion of expected damage over the next 30 years. Joining us today on our Florida Insurance Roundup podcast is the co-author of that working paper, Evan Hernstadt, economist at the Congressional Budget Office in Washington, D.C. Evan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm always excited to talk about our work at CBO.
We appreciate you being here. And joining us from the New Jersey headquarters of floodproofing.com is Tom Little, its president and CEO. Floodproofing.com is an integrated company providing both wet and dry floodproofing solutions. Its Risk Reduction Plus group has fine-tuned flood risk analysis and offers flood insurance as well. Tom is a certified floodplain manager and is also vice chair of the Flood Mitigation Industry Association. Tom, welcome to our podcast.
Lisa, thanks for having me. It's always fantastic to talk with you and excited to be on.
Thank you. And I first met you, if you will recall, over a decade ago and have followed your work ever since, Tom. Floodproofing.com has really become an international leader in protecting communities and businesses from these horrible effects of flooding across the country like we're seeing in South Florida. Evan, the Congressional Budget Office, or the CBO as we often call it, is the research arm of the U.S. Congress, and it is tasked with providing nonpartisan analysis for lawmakers to consider when making policy. That includes budget and economic projections. So, Evan, how did you get involved in this project, and what was the genesis for doing it, and what were you looking to find out? I'm really intrigued by the fact that you've taken such great time to study this topic.
First, I want to note that my co-author on this project was Jared Jagler, who's our excellent assistant analyst at CBO. And Jared and I noted there's a lot of congressional and other policy interest in disaster mitigation programs, especially as climate change becomes more and more salient. So we started looking into federal spending on adaptation to flood risk, and we found that there's a big literature out there, but it can be really difficult to compare across studies and apply one context to another. And CBO is always going to have a nationwide scope and need for its analyses. And so we would need a scalable and flexible approach. And we found that it was feasible for us to use the National Structure Inventory from the Army Corps of Engineers and flood modeling from the First Street Foundation, and combine that with some other work to estimate avoided damage from property level interventions like buyouts and elevations.
I have to tell you, Evan, that this topic of flooding, how to fix it, how to mitigate it, how to prevent it, how to have adequate insurance so that we can protect against flood damage. It's all near and dear to my heart. And most of you who know me throughout my career, it's been one of the hallmarks of the public policy in which I have worked. And here in Florida, if your driver's license says Florida, you should have flood insurance. If it rains, it can flood. And we see so much of flood, not only in coastal areas, but inland from hurricanes Ian and Nicole just 2 years ago. And we're still cleaning that up. And homeowners have frankly struggled to repair or rebuild. And this paper that you've written that I want our entire audience to read, it'll be in our show notes. It's called Flood Damage Avoided by Potential Spending on Property Level Adaptations. Share with us the major findings that you have discovered with your brilliant co-author, and then I want to get Tom's perspective about it. Evan?
As you noted, we spent a lot of time on this paper, and one of the challenges was trying to figure out where to draw the line. There's so much interesting stuff. So feel free to cut me off if I go on and on. But in our main analysis, we estimate the avoided damage and project costs for property elevations and buyouts nationwide, and we're focused on residential properties with 1 to 4 housing units. So what's typically called a single family home in like the mortgage literature, for example. We found that about 1.3 million projects nationwide have more avoided damage than costs. And those, as you noted, would result in about $500 billion of avoided damage discounted over the next 30 years for an average avoided damage per dollar spent of about $2.70. Many of these projects, about 100,000 of them, have an avoided damage per dollar of at least $6. So there's a lot of variation, and there are some of these very high payback opportunities.
If I understand you correctly, this Congress, you're maybe suggesting, recommending to spend a couple $100 billion, which is nothing in our multiple $1 trillion budget, to prevent $500 billion in damage. Is that it in a nutshell?
So we don't make policy recommendations at CBO. Really what we're trying to do is just characterize, the set of opportunities out there and try to give a picture of how sets of projects or different contexts or different allocation schemes might affect that sort of avoided damage number. I'll note that the current obligations from FEMA on property level spending are more on the order of several $100 million a year. So, we're just putting information out there for Congress, and they can, take it and use it to inform whatever decisions they want to make.
We're just hoping that there's some congressional officials listening to this podcast. Tom, this is right up your alley. This has been your life's work. And Evan has basically, without you two knowing each other, written a white paper, if you will, that underscores what you already know, that if you do certain things to properties and make them stronger and better against Mother Nature, you reduce the risk of loss, is the term that we use in insurance. So talk to us about this CBO paper, why you were so excited to read it when I called you and told you about it. What can it do to help educate members of the communities? And of course, what you're doing with floodproofing.com to help the situation.
Well, first and foremost, Evan, it's fantastic work. You and Jared did an amazing job. And from an industry perspective, this is the type of information that we need to get out there to continue to build awareness that we can actually invest money and get a strong return on that investment by retrofitting the existing infrastructure that we have. I know that focused on residential, but the same rules apply, or the same analysis would apply to non-residential and our commercial structures. So it's amazing work, and it's exciting to see something come out, from a government standpoint like this. It really lines up too with the National Institute of Building Science, right? NIBS, and what they put out there. And as I was reading through this, one example of how this is being applied, Lisa, to your point, from an insurance standpoint, our good friends over at FM Global probably one of the world's, if not the world's largest mutual insurance company, over the past 2 years has provided back to their insured $650 million to be utilized towards resilient measures being implemented into their structures. And so they've run analysis. They've seen that mitigation works to reduce overall exposure and damage cost. And it's just great work to get out there. One of the things that stood out in the paper is the elevation. And from our industry, what you folks do, other manufacturers, other companies, specifically what we do day in and day out. And as you said, certainly our passion is we're never going to stop the floods. They will keep coming. But what we do here at floodproofing.com and from our industry is, we prevent the buildings and the homes from being flooded, right? With mitigation efforts and different forms, elevation, engineered flood openings in those foundations, wet floodproofing techniques, dry floodproofing. But I love how you guys really build into this, how elevation can make a dramatic difference. There's a whole industry out there that has jacking systems. The International Association of Structural Movers is a dedicated association to structural moving, which includes elevation of existing homes and buildings. And I'll tell you, the industry is ready for this investment to happen. It is ready for these homes to go up in the air. And we can mitigate those risks and make them more fortified. And then, Lisa, to tie it back to insurance, we can dramatically reduce the NFIP, but also the private carriers that are in the market. We can reduce exposure dramatically. So happy that you championed this. We're behind it. The Flood Mitigation Industry Association, who I'm the vice chair of, this is something that we're definitely going to be getting to our members too, to build awareness around the great work you guys have done.
And Tom, the Flood Mitigation Industry Association has really done some great work. A lot of people don't know the term flood proofing. I mean, you hear waterproof. Explain to the audience wet flood proofing, dry flood proofing, and use your home as an example. What does that mean?
Let's start with wet flood proofing. In the paper that Evan's speaking to, one of the mitigation methods was to elevate your home. So if you have a slab on grade structure in southern Florida, we're able to come in and that house is exposed to floodwater, right? It's sitting right on the ground. So what we're able to do is actually get up underneath that slab. If it's a structural slab, we can actually lift that slab up in the air. Or if it's not a structurally reinforced slab, we would be able to disconnect the rest of the house from the slab and then elevate that. Either way, we can now lift that house up in the air. We utilize a unified jacking system and put the jacks at various points, pull a lever, and they all go up at the same time. It's amazing. We've been doing this actually, though, for dang near 100 years. And now we elevate that structure up above the design flood elevation. We'll add in freeboard to go even higher. And now that the house is elevated, we'll build a new foundation. And that's where you'll utilize compliant engineered flood openings around the foundation to relieve hydrostatic pressure off the wall during a flood. This way the foundation doesn't collapse. But we're allowing that water into that space. So that enclosed space below the elevated first living floor can only be used for parking, storage, and building access. And that's because we know it's going to flood at one point. So you're going to use flood resistant materials. We're going to allow the water in. We're going to allow the water back out. But we're going to have a structurally sound foundation and at a high and dry living floor above the whatever the potential flood depth might be. So that's a form of wet flood proofing. We elevate, we allow the water to travel underneath the structure, and it's safe and sound. The other form of flood proofing would be dry flood proofing. And with dry flood proofing, instead of relieving pressure off the walls, we're resisting the water from coming into the structure. It's from a new construction standpoint, you're able to utilize that technique in commercial, non-residential structures. But if you have an existing home, we'll say in southern Florida, and it's getting hit with rain right now and severe flooding, those slab on grade homes, there are products and solutions out there that can go into a door frame and prevent 1 foot, 2 foot of floodwater from flowing through your residential property. So there are applications for residential homes that work extremely well for especially what Southern Florida is experiencing now. But those are going to keep the space dry and prevent the water from coming in.
And Evan, you noted in your paper that NFIP doesn't seem to recognize those very effective measures. What did you write about? What did you discover in your research about what NFIP does or does not do when it comes to wet floodproofing, dry floodproofing mitigation measures?
Yeah, so I think as we note in the paper, my understanding is that dry floodproofing isn't like an approved method of mitigating flood damage for substantially damaged or substantially improved properties. They do talk about it in the non-residential space quite a bit in their literature, but we're modeling residential areas. And then on top of that, just the historical funding of disaster mitigation programs through FEMA have not funded much residential floodproofing at all, which reflects this. And so that's why our main analysis only has elevations and buyouts in it. But we do have an additional scenario later in the paper where we look at dry floodproofing for homes that have, appropriate attributes. And we did find that you could provide protection to a large number of properties for which the avoided damage outweighs the cost, and at a relatively low cost, because these are, less costly than buying an entire house and the land it sits on. That said, in our modeling, these are going to be homes that are subject to less severe flooding. And so the expected damage avoided is less, but that doesn't take away from the fact that you're adapting a household that may not have been able to do one of these other measures.
So let's take it down to real. Let's say that of the 7 million homes in Florida, 1 million of them were built before 1960. And you have a home, say, in the Coral Gables that it was built in 1945, slab on grade. What, Tom, can you do to help that home? Is there anything that could be done to that old structure, slab on grade, beautiful structure that we all know that Florida's famous for, to try to shore up that home against Mother Nature?
There's a couple different options. From our point of view, what we do in our business is we will, we'll analyze that particular structure. We'll look at an elevation certificate if available for that. We're going to examine how that structure was built, right? So if it's slab on grade, is it stick framed up above that slab, or is it concrete, right? If it's a concrete built home, well, then that allows us to maybe protect floodwater from getting into that actual shell of the home up to 2 foot. There's products that are off the shelf, standardized products that can be put inside the door jamb that will provide you up to 28 inches of flood protection. And there's no anchor. Yep, there's no anchor points. It can be installed in less than 5 minutes by just about everyone. And it has a 3-sided seal, the bottom, and then the 2 sides. And what it does is you ratchet it to squeeze it inside the door jamb. And then there's a pump, and you pump an inflatable gasket to seal up the sides. And there's even a gauge. And when it's in green, it's sealed. As we speak, many of those are actually deployed right now in Florida due to the floodwaters and this heavy rainfall event. So that's an example of an option that's kind of off the shelf, fairly inexpensive, give you up to 28 inches of protection. Now, there could be other penetrations, Lisa, that we'll look into. Are there other openings? There's maybe windows. So when we do an analysis on a structure like that, we're going to inspect, okay, where can water find its way in? Because there might be other areas that we have to seal. If the building is strong enough, there's custom flood panels that are available that can be sized for just about any style opening. There's aluminum flood logs. There's aluminum panels that can be custom made to overcome obstructions. And part of the analysis is we have to make sure that the structure itself can hold back the floodwater. So these solutions are engineered and performance tested, and we know they're going to work when they're in place. but we got to make sure that the foundation is strong enough to withstand whatever the heights of the floodwater may be. So that's always an option, especially if it's a concrete built home. Even if it's a framed home, the products and solutions that exist for a slab on grade house that are available, for instance, in our product catalog, they're reusable and they're going to be way more effective than a sandbag, right? And there's always a lot of talk about, we could put sandbags in front. Water's finding their way through those. Then you have to dispose of them and so forth. They're ineffective. So the products that are available can be an ideal solution that you can have right in your garage and put in place. Now, if you're dealing with potential flood heights, 3, 4, and 5 feet, and we're speaking to a residential unit, best case scenario though is always get that house up in the air. And Evan and the work in his paper really spotlighted that, right? And so if we can get in there and elevate the structure, that's always the best to get that home high and dry. You're now going to have a passive approach to providing flood protection for the home and the family, most importantly, right? To ensure they're not displaced. That's you'll elevate, put in flood vents, and they'll do the job from there. So it's really an analysis when we're looking at an existing structure, how it's built, when it was built, what type of materials, what are the potential flood depths that we're going to be dealing with, and what's the flooding source. We're going to examine where's that water coming from. Are we dealing with flash flooding, coastal flooding, pluvial style flooding, which we're seeing more rapidly, in these urban areas. So it's an analysis that we have to do, but there are solutions.
I think what you're saying to us is that sandbags versus using some of these mechanisms, the cost benefit would be that the mechanisms and the products that are out there are a much better solution. Evan, maybe that could be your next paper. Evan, I want to close it out with you. From what I'm reading, there's a new paper coming out in June, flood insurance in communities at risk of flooding. Is that right? And what will that tell us? And will it look at some of these mechanisms that Tom is talking about? In fact, Tom, I'm going to let you do a little commercial as we close about this new company that you've acquired that makes some of these products. Help us understand, Evan, what you're going to be looking at in that paper, if you can give us a sneak preview.
So I'm going to have to disappoint you on this one. We don't really comment on CBO projects until they're released officially and publicly. But my colleagues have been working on the paper you're referring to. We've also published a lot of great work on disaster risk, insurance, and climate change in recent months and years, and there's going to be more coming in the next several months. So I encourage your readers to keep an eye out. Readers, sorry. I'm on the podcast.
Listeners, reader, they read. A lot of our listeners do read, Evan, trust me. Tom, I want you to tell us quickly about this. These new companies, you've researched the market, you found the perfect match between your company and another. How is that going to help the move ahead, good flood mitigation efforts?
Thank you for bringing that up, Lisa. So in the intro, you explained, our business company name, floodproofing.com. The name kind of says it all. Any of the listeners can go to floodproofing.com and see everything that we do, product-wise, service-wise. A lot of folks in this industry know us for our brand of products, engineered flood vents, Smart Vent. We also have another line called Freedom Flood Vent. But really excited that one of our close partners in our distribution side of our business, we've recently done a couple acquisitions. One of those was to bring in a full turnkey service to provide for commercial structures installation of those dry floodproofing and wet floodproofing products. And then along with that, brought in a premier product line called Flood Panel, which is a line of dry flood protection products and solutions that include aluminum flood logs with an industry-leading 12-inch tall log. We also have in that product line watertight flood doors. So when you shut the door and lock the door, it is now sealed and will hold back, more than 7 foot of water over those doors. And then in addition, custom panels, as mentioned earlier, that can go around just about any obstacle and so forth. So really excited to have that product line to really fill out our products and services that we're able to, provide to the industry for residential and commercial structures, both new construction and also retrofitting those existing buildings that are out there.
We're going to watch you grow and thrive, Tom. We're here with you, and you've got a new friend in Evan and his work. So between his good public policy and what you're doing, actually what I call getting to the real and putting these products into these homes, it's going to be a great time. So with that, I just want to thank you, Tom, for being here and being a part of this. It means a lot to me and our firm, and that you continue to do the great work that you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and I appreciate you having us on.
Absolutely. And Evan, we have discovered and will be rocking along with your good work. I did not know that you were with the CBO. I follow some of their work in other arenas. So you now will have another guru or two watching and all the good stuff you're putting in the marketplace. And my insurance company brethren will be reading it carefully and using it in their work as well. So thank you for joining us.
Well, yeah, thanks so much for having me on. And thanks to you as well, Tom. It's really interesting hearing your perspective.
Great meeting you, Evan.
So, we have developers and engineers listening to this podcast, and I encourage you to check out Tom's website, floodproofing.com, that plug, because I know it's one of the best in the business. They're the only organization that I can think of that is out there providing a total flood mitigation solution, from assessing the risk to finding the right mitigation retrofits to fix it, to installing them, to insuring them. It's pretty cool. For the rest of our listeners, I've said many times, if it can rain, it can flood. And if your driver's license says Florida, you should have flood insurance. There's no such thing as an X zone, though FEMA may disagree with me. As we know, flooding is the most common and costly natural disaster. I mean, when you see 40% of the NFIP claims are coming from outside of high flood risk areas. Even in X zones, you're seeing these claims. Most homeowners, commercial and renters insurance policies don't cover flood. And I want so many of you who are not insurance technically savvy, and I have many other industry listeners, buy flood insurance. Call your agent, explore it. Don't think your property insurance covers it. It just does not. And it's not expensive in some cases. Some cases it is, but at least explore it. In our podcast show notes, we'll have a link to Evan's report, the Congressional Budget Office report, and a list of other reports that either he or other of his colleagues have written. And there's lots of helpful resources there, including the floodproofing.com website and the good stuff they have there. And I'll make sure that we put up a written summary of this conversation here today. There's a lot of good stuff packed in it. Obviously, we take the notes so you don't have to. We want to hear from you what your experience has been with either flooding or making sure your home is protected against flood. Always want to hear from you. And you can leave us a message on air, if you will, calling 850-388-8002. That's 850-388-8002. Or send me an email, Lisa Miller at lisamillerassociates.com. That's Lisa Miller at lisamillerassociates.com. So just be sure to, if you would like us and follow us on your favorite social media platform, Facebook, I'm still going to call it Twitter, and of course, LinkedIn. We just appreciate you pushing out our information with the ways that you do it in your own industry and business. And tell your friends about what we're doing. That's it for the Florida Insurance Roundup today. I appreciate you being a part of it and supporting our work and listening to us share with you news you can use. Remember, at Lisa Miller & Associates, we've got a passion for policy and a client success. I'm Lisa Miller. Until next time, stay safe.
This has been Lisa Miller & Associates Florida Insurance Roundup, your podcast on the people, issues, and regulations shaping Florida's insurance market. For more information on today's program, please visit us on the web at www.lisamillerassociates.com.